We got weeded down to a few tens of thousands of people periodically. And so we became very homogenous because of this. Whenever we would mix together, there was only a limited population that became almost completely homogenous. And this is one of the points I wanted to make of how not different we are from each other. Yes, we groups of us evolved separately in different places over hundreds of thousands of years, but there was always this mixing together and homogenization as populations crashed. And it was one of these tiny sort of splinter populations that was able to go across the Sinai and get to the Middle East, and then was able to spread out, interbreed with Neanderthals, and then spread out across Europe. And kill everything else, including Neanderthals. But that's our history. We always competed with the other people we would meet, and then also interbreed with them.
Today is Friday, August 30th. It is the end of what has felt like a very long, hot summer, the hottest summer in recorded history. How are you doing, Josh?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to be back here. Thought we'd get a lot of work done during the summer, but it turned out not to be that way.
It was a busy summer.
It was a very busy summer between kids and sweltering. We didn't get any recording done, but I'm glad to be back. And I'm particularly glad to be back because I want to address something that a mutual friend of Eric's and mine, Robert, has brought up, and I just want to really address this head on because he's a friend of the show. He does the music for our show, and he's a smart individual who I want to engage. So he's probably listened to this more than anyone else, and he went back over the summer and listened to all the shows, and he pointed out that I say when humans left Africa, and that this could be problematic, which I had not thought about this. It had not occurred to me. And
there are still people there.
Exactly. There are still people there. And I obviously wasn't thinking of it that way, but it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. Particularly because people like me, i.e. white males, tend to think that they're speaking about everyone and themselves at the same time when they say we. And it's a sort of unconscious bias that happens all the time. One giant leap for mankind, one giant leap for man, and one giant leap for mankind.
Thank
you. Sorry, completely forgot that.
One step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And completely got that wrong because they're the same thing and couldn't figure out how to say it. But that's the typical kind of stuff that men tend to say, particularly white men. And so I just wanted to address this, that when I'm talking about people leaving Africa, there are obviously people still in Africa. And that the bias on my part is largely because I couldn't even imagine it any other way. That when I talk about people coming from Africa, obviously, Africa is primary. It's not just the soil from which we grew, or even the roots. It's the soil, it's the roots, it's the trunk, and it's most of the branches. And only one tiny branch was able to leave Africa and then spread across the world. But the humanity is from Africa and has always been in Africa. And it is only a very minor portion of our population that was ever able to leave.
And then what happened was we didn't leave. Humanity spread.
Yeah. And it's always been that. And it's very difficult because of the history of racism and the way we think about race to see this connection. We think of sub-Saharan Africa as some sort of separate thing, and it is by no means that way. And so it comes out in the way we talk about things. So we have this phrase "out of Africa." It's been there since the Romans. Sempre nova ex Africa. It's always something new out of Africa. And that we think about there's this place, and that we come out of it. And we really need to think about it as we come from it. And I just wanted to emphasize that. And I wanted to talk about one of the sort of misconceptions that I think is still happening because of this problem of really seeing sub-Saharan Africa not being connected. Now, the problem is the Sahara in some ways. The Sahara is this huge desert blocking Mediterranean culture from these southern African cultures. And so from the Egyptians to the Greeks to the Romans, we thought of Mediterranean culture as essentially being this separate group that then gave rise to European cultures, to a certain extent Asian culture. Certainly we left from this area. And I just wanted to emphasize how not true that is. And that this is based on two things. One is it's based on the sort of happenstance of difference in melanin, making us feel separate in some way, making some of us feel separate in some way, and the Sahara being an actual physical gap. And I was thinking about this in relation to the very long-standing debate on the idea of Black Egyptians and how many scholars in Europe, essentially for racist reasons, were denying the idea of Black Egyptians for a long time. And then in the late 70s, you had people like Henry Louis Gates talking about Black Egyptians. And then you had people saying, no, they weren't Black Egyptians, and they were talking about DNA. And all of this debate is essentially false. Because melanin does not define humanity. And the idea of it being a separate group around the Mediterranean, being separate from Southern Africa, is entirely a false perception. And I want you to think about how people moved through Africa and the importance of the Nile River. If you look at the cradle of humanity, you look at East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, up into Ethiopia, you'll see the Serengeti, where we evolved, where we learned to throw stuff at other stuff and became big-brained creatures and developed tools. That's all sitting just south of the Sahara, with the Nile River running from Sudan north across the Sahara directly to Egypt. And that is the trunk of the tree of humanity, is the Nile River. It is how we moved up from Africa, through Africa, and able to move into the northern shores of Africa and along the Mediterranean. And then from there, essentially right through Israel, Middle East, the places we keep on bombing each other, Gaza. That is the connection right there, Gaza. And it's bizarre to me that we are constantly fighting in these areas. Just like when we were in Iraq, and I realized it was between the Tigris and Euphrates, we're bombing Eden. Now we're involved in the main way we as a species move. We're bombing that place. Gaza is where this connection is. And it's just horrific to me that we even see ourselves as separate peoples in any way, because it is all physically connected. And so if you physically connected and really not just incidentally, but primarily through the Nile. And so you have people like Cuvier, 18th century French scientist, trying to argue that Egyptians were Caucasian. You have lots of arguments back and forth for a long time. 19th century, you've got people saying no, they were Black Africans, and it was all about race and pigmentation, and never about the idea that, of course, there is this connection between Southern Africa and everything else via the Nile, and that Egypt was really central to our motion as a species, growing up and spreading out of Africa, from Africa. That these are basically one solid conduit. And if you look at the pictures of the Nile, you can see this green band running up through the Sahara. And so Egypt was never a separate place. It was always connected. The Egyptian empires went all the way down to Sudan. There was dynasties from Sudan who conquered Egypt. It was always mixed back and forth. The idea of Egypt not being African is crazy. It has always been a African civilization, and has always been the cradle of humanity. So our roots might be further south in Kenya, Tanzania. But as we started to move, as we started to mix together, as we became humans, we were always traveling up and down the Nile. Around 400,000 years ago, there were separate populations in Africa. So there was groups in Morocco who were developing the rounded skulls that modern humans have. We have a very round skull. There were groups in closer to South Africa, South Central Africa, where our X chromosomes developed. So obviously the X chromosomes we have to be part of the same humanity that has the round skulls, but they've developed in different parts of Africa and then mixed together. Our Y chromosomes come from still another part of Africa. And obviously the Y chromosomes and the X chromosomes have to be part of all of humanity together. So this movement up and down through humanity is how we became humans. It was taking occasionally isolated populations, groups of genes that they would develop that had advantages in that isolated situation. And then during periods of warming, particularly the Eemian interglacial, around 300,000 years ago, these were times when all of our populations would grow and they would mix together. And then when it became colder again, we would be isolated and develop specific genes. So it was periods of time during the Ice Age. We as a species, as genus Homo, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthal, Homo sapien, all of that was being put together in the Middle Paleolithic because of climate change. Because it would get colder, the Sahara would get bigger, populations would get isolated, then it would get warmer again, the Sahara would bloom, and we could move through it. And so this is this sort of cycle of colder to warmer that isolated us and then mixed us together. And when we were isolated, we would get down to very low numbers. It's amazing we survived as a species at all.
Now, when you say we were isolated, you mean there were pockets of
proto-humans, archaic humans
that were existing contemporaneously, but isolated from each other.
From each other, all over Africa, yes. North Africa, South Africa. And then during times when things were great and the Sahara was a beautiful grassland, people would move around and these would mix together.
And how much time was between these epochs, I guess?
The interglacials might last a few 100,000 years.
So it was long enough for actual evolutionary changes to take place.
Yeah. So if you think about the different ages of the Paleolithic, you have the lower Paleolithic, known as the Old Stone Age in Africa. And this was when we were first developing big brains and some of our simpler tools, the hand axe. Middle Paleolithic is when we start getting spears and we start getting more abstract thought. This is the time when the characteristics of modern humans are starting to develop. Somewhere along the lines, we get a chin. We still don't know why we got a chin.
But you're saying that this is all part of having been coming together and then being isolated from each other and having time to evolve separately and then come back together and mix that DNA again.
And going through very, very small populations. So we were
weeded down very
We
much,
got weeded down to a few tens of thousands of people periodically. And so we became very homogenous because of this. Whenever we would mix together, there was only a limited population that became almost completely homogenous. And this is one of the points I wanted to make of how not different we are from each other. Yes, we groups of us evolved separately in different places over hundreds of thousands of years, but there was always this mixing together and homogenization as populations crashed. And it was one of these tiny sort of splinter populations that was able to go across the Sinai and get to the Middle East, and then was able to spread out, interbreed with Neanderthals, and then spread out across Europe.
And
kill everything else, including Neanderthals. But that's our history. With it, we always competed with the other people we would meet, and then also interbreed with them. And so that is absolutely part of our history. But going back to the idea of the Nile as connecting the Mediterranean area with the southern African area, it really fundamentally shows Egypt as a African civilization, and that all the arguments over whether it is black or not is immaterial. I remember being an undergraduate, and some of the sort of late 80s, Black Egyptian stuff was happening. And I was somewhat bothered by this because it seemed like false scholarship. And I think it was. I mean, if you go to the Met, you can see they depict people from Ethiopia with a darker skin color than other groups, but all of that was meaningless. And what I wasn't realizing is the people who were saying, "Look, the Egyptians were a Black African group." While they might not have been correct about skin pigmentation, they were correct about fundamentally understanding Egypt as an African civilization. And that this is what the modern scholarship is now saying, is that there were a variety of different pigmentation levels and types in North Africa. This was the populations mixing around. This was what Africa does, is it takes populations and it mixes them as they go along these river valleys. There's places where everyone has to come together as they're traveling north. There's only one way through along the Nile, and then they spread out again. And so you have this bringing together and mixing and then spreading out, and that this was specifically happening in Egypt.
And you're also saying this was happening long prior, this exact same thing enforced upon us by geological and environmental situations.
Yes, yeah, and it really only has been about 600 generations since the end of the Ice Age. So we really haven't evolved much since then. There's been very, very little change, and that we're essentially an entirely homogenous population.
Well, and now we're not in a position to be isolated.
Well, now we're moving around a lot in as well. But I think I've said it before, but I really like the example of a chimpanzee from the Eastern Congo is more genetically distinct from a chimpanzee from the Western Congo than a human from, say, England would be from a human from Papua New Guinea. Say, an uncontacted tribe in Papua New Guinea has more in common to, say, me than chimps from the other sides of the Congo. And we think of chimps as exactly the same. We don't think of different races of chimps. We really, yeah.
No, we don't.
We really don't. And they're more genetically distinct than groups of humans are. And so this is just all this huge fallacy that has been with us for a very long time, by the accident of history causing differences in skin pigmentation, and our perception of the Southern African groups being somehow cut off from what's happening in Northern Africa. And that's very much not true. The Nile River runs right through it, and there's always been a continuous genetic flow back and forth and continuous cultural flows as well. And so there is no separation, and that anyone trying to say, European culture has this origin in Egyptian culture, and therefore is this North African thing that's somehow superior to what was happening in Southern Africa is nonsense.
Yes, well, there are all sorts of people trying to rank civilizations all over the place today. But I think that, part of what Robert was getting at,
yes,
was our need to be aware that the language that we use is rooted in an era where there was no other language to use, but now there is.
Yeah,
we didn't know, and we were raised by people who had no perception of what we understand now.
But also, I think it is technically correct to say, we as a species left Africa, like we as a species crossed Africa on the Nile. We as a species has moved apart and come together. Yeah, exactly. So I think it is
not leave.
Some of us left.
Some of us left,
yeah,
but not all of us
Right.
left.
Yeah. So these are indeed important distinctions,
but they are also completely fed by the history, the history of humanity that I certainly don't know.
Yeah.
These things inform this.
Yeah, and it really became important for Europeans in particular to try and separate themselves from Africa once scientific racism started happening. So you have, religious-based differences between groups, you have cultural-based differences between groups, but once you get into the age of reason, That's when Europeans in particular started getting really nasty.
And we will weaponize anything we can.
And becoming a justification for slavery, colonialization, not just a justification, but a mandate for these things because of our somehow superior natures, which was always entirely false. I mean, certainly the Egyptians would have never even imagined these ideas. They would not have seen themselves as separate from any other group because they were physically connected, and they'd always seen there was differences between, say, the Upper Nile and the Lower Nile, with say the origin of the Jewish people with the Hyksos in the Lower Nile and the Upper Nile being closer to Ethiopia.
This is what bothers me with the concept of American exceptionalism.
Yeah, we are not different people.
We're not. Yeah, yes, and it's I feel like it's all coming from the same place.
And it's also something that it makes America wonderful, is our ability to be a group of different cultures coming together. And if we want to look at historical precedents, we should maybe not be looking to Rome. Maybe we should be looking to Egypt. We should be looking to a place that wasn't out conquering the world, but a place that was mixing peoples, and a place that was building culture over a very long period of time and developing the principles of mathematics and the principles of how we understand the world around us through observation of the Nile flooding. We understand how the stars move through the sky. We can predict where the seasons are coming from. All of this is coming directly from the Egyptians, through the Babylonians, to the Greeks, to the Jewish peoples who are developing their understandings of the world. Monotheism coming from Egypt to the Jews. All of these concepts are directly rooted in Africa. They are from Africa, but they are African. So when I say we came from Africa, these are African people who came from Africa. That's what I'm trying to get at. Now, there are racists out there who like to say, well, since we're all African, I can't possibly be racist. I'm not saying that. All right. There are certainly African cultures that have their own histories, and African cultures. There are certainly European cultures that have their own history and their own cultures. They're not exactly the same things. But what I'm trying to point out is this real through line through Egypt and through the Nile, crossing the Sahara, and how there is no break. There never was a break. There's no separation.
And there was also no other way.
There is no other way. Exactly.
This is the only path.
Yeah, and the importance of both Egypt and where Israel is as well, historically, and that this was the path to the Fertile Crescent. This is how we got to these places, and how we developed civilization itself was from this movement. From Egypt through the Fertile Crescent, through developing agriculture. Africa doesn't have its own breed of cows. Africa has its own breeds of cows. It doesn't have its own genetic lineage of cows. There's two genetic lineages of cows in the world. Well, that's not true either. There's two main ones. there's the European cows, Bus taurus, and there's the cows from India, Bus indica. And these populations actually were coming the other direction. So those two populations mixed in North Africa, in Egypt. People taking those cows in Egypt, the Egyptian cow, Hathor, the major aspect of their civilization, essentially represented civilization to the Egyptians. Those were the cows that moved south along the Nile and became the cows that the Maasai in Kenya, Tanzania are they're herders. They're pastoralist people. So the people who are now living where humans evolved are also directly connected to what is north of the Sahara. There is no separation. The cultures move both ways. And they really always have. So if you look at, say, the fantastic cows with the giant horns from like Zimbabwe or something like that, and you think, well, these are clearly African cows. They are clearly African cows. They've been there for thousands of years, but that's thousands of years. That's not millions of years. These are mixes of European and Indian groups that have interbred and formed these unique populations in southern Africa.
Having met in Africa.
Having met in Africa, yeah, and probably having met in Egypt first. So the first cattle in Egypt are shown to be they're Bus taurus, the European cattle, but then very quickly you start seeing influxes of the Indian cattle. The cows from India tend to be more resistant to diseases that are common in hotter climates. So they had useful genetics, and people recognized that early on, and the groups were being interbred.
I've always said mutts are the strongest and the smartest, the
well,
best.
Humans are only mutts. We don't have any purebred anything. And really never have.
I love that. There are so many people out there in the media that would disagree with that statement.
Well, they're just so fundamentally wrong. And while science has a lot to answer for in its defense of racism and slavery and colonialism, the nice thing about science is when it meets facts, it can at least slowly start to change its mind. If you have, say, racism based on religion, it's much more difficult to be flexible in response. But when you start meeting, new ideas, science has a little bit of better ability to change its mind. Now, often you have to wait a generation. The people who are existing today might not be able to change their mind.
Yeah, well, that's deeply frustrating because a generation is my lifetime.
Yes, exactly. No, we never move fast enough.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for the noise outside, but let's continue anyway.
Okay, I can't even think at this point. Yeah, all right.
We go.
We seem to be over. Yeah. So I just wanted to talk about that and say that I apologize for any misphrasing to think that humans as a group somehow left Africa and weren't there anymore, but that
there were two groups,
or that there were in any way two groups,
in any way
two groups. There's only one group of humans, and always has been one group of humans, and that group has a direct connection along the Nile through Egypt and then right into the Middle East and then spreading out from there, and that it has always been connected. There was never a disconnect. There's never been a time when it wasn't connected. There's always been through lines of genes and animals and creatures. Are there any chickens in Africa? Yes, there are chickens in Africa. Where did those chickens come from? They come from Malaysia. There's always been things spreading along these trade routes. Now, there are also coastal routes as well, but those would have been happening much later. Humans weren't very good at boats at first, so following the rivers across the Sahara would have been the way, and very specifically the Nile.
But again, you're putting Africa not just as the cradle of humanity, but the crossroads of humanity for thousands of years.
Yeah, absolutely, and that the real only difference that non-sub-Saharan Africans have is the slightly larger amount of Neanderthal genes, 1 or 2%. But if you think about what makes us truly human, everything that makes us truly human evolved in Africa, in one of these populations within Africa. From our reproduction to our brains to our language capabilities, all of these things are in Africa, and all of them were very heavily selected for. The genes we got from Neanderthals are only things like skin color and hair. They're superficial. Couple of them might be slightly less superficial, such as our immune systems. It seems as though a lot of our autoimmune diseases might be a heritage of the Neanderthals. If you're moving into a new area, the genes you want to pick up are the ones that protect against the diseases in this new area. But you don't want to get rid of your superior language abilities. We were able to outcompete the Neanderthals probably because of our imagination and our ability to speak the way we do. Neanderthals undoubtedly had language. They even seem to have, the beginnings of cultures, but it wasn't really until they encountered us that they were able to do anything like art or their more advanced tools. That was after they'd interbred with us. First time we left Africa, I don't think we survived. I think the first group was about 100,000 years ago. Again, I'm talking about us leaving Africa, but definitely we're still in Africa. But that first group was wiped out about 100,000 years ago. However, genes moved into the Neanderthals, which they took up. So we never took up any Neanderthal brain genes, as far as I can tell, but they took our brain genes. So they suddenly were able to do things with their art that they hadn't had art until they encountered us. So they start encountering us. They pick up some X chromosomes from us. They pick up some the mitochondrial DNA starts going into the Neanderthals. And so at the same time, I suspect that they were getting the ability to do the advanced tools and the art that they acquired around that time. When we finally survived around 60,000 years ago, that was a group of probably less than 10,000 people who were crossing from Egypt into the Middle East. And they were a very small, very homogenous group of Africans who then were able to interbreed with Neanderthals and then eventually push them out, taking only a tiny bit of that Neanderthal DNA with them. And that's the only thing that you could say genetically separates that group from sub-Saharan Africans. But even those people, once they developed agriculture,
if you can go one way, you can go the other way.
You can go the other way, exactly.
It can't just stay in one place.
Exactly. So those genes came down with the cows.
That's what you're saying. And these became routes of trade for millennia. It's not something that can.
Yeah. So with the cows and with the chickens, we were also getting a little bit of Neanderthal DNA coming down into sub-Saharan Africa.
I have to apologize for living in Manhattan, Upper Manhattan.
Yeah, I think I'm done now. I can't talk anymore.
Noisy. Anyway, I just want to thank Robert for listening to all of this all the way through more than once, and also for bringing this topic up, because it's important, and I really want what you're saying to be received in some form in the way that you intend it to be received.
All right, thank you so much.
All right, thanks everyone. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to Mind Body Evolution with Dr. Josh Stout and Eric Burkell. Go to mindbodyevolution.info for